She is unfit, the High Counselor said, and his voice carried the way voices do when a man has never once had to repeat himself. Unfit by blood, by status, and by the old law, she has no place beside a king. Sorcha heard it from the corridor. She had not meant to stop walking. Her feet simply ceased to obey her the moment his syllables found her through the cracked council chamber door. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and made herself breathe. She had been called many things in her 26 years. Unfit was not new. What was new was hearing it said in a chamber full of men who held her future in their ink-stained hands. She was Caucasian and pale as birch bark in winter, and her hair was the color of ash-brown river water, neither dramatic nor forgettable, which had always seemed appropriate for a woman of her rank. Omega, unmated, a ward of the Thornvale pack whose status had been managed and shuffled and deferred since her parents died when she was 11, leaving her nothing but a surname that meant very little to anyone who hadn't loved them. The counselor was still speaking. She forced herself to listen. The king requires a mate whose bloodline supports the succession. The council has identified 3 candidates. We recommend the process begin before winter. A long silence, then a voice Sorcha had not heard in 4 years, low, unhurried, and carrying its own kind of authority, said, "No." Just that. One word, but it landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, and Sorcha felt it move through the wall and into her ribcage. Merrick. She closed her eyes. 4 years, and her body still knew his voice before her mind did. She made herself walk. The corridor stretched ahead of her, long and gray, and lit by the narrow windows that faced the winter courtyard, and she put one foot in front of the other until she reached the far staircase and descended it and pushed out into the cold air of the outer yard. The morning was sharp and bright, the kind of brightness that promises nothing. She crossed the frost-cracked stones toward the ward's small garden, which no one visited in January, and she sat on the low wall beside the bare rose canes and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and told herself that she had heard nothing, that it meant nothing, that Merrick refusing the council's list of suitable mates was a political matter and had nothing to do with her. She almost believed it. She had last seen him at midsummer 4 years ago, the summer before he was crowned. He had come back from the border campaign leaner and quieter, and she had been 19, and they had sat in this same garden, and he had said things she had spent 4 years trying to reclassify as ordinary. He had told her she smelled like cedar and the first cold morning of autumn. He had said it the way a man says something he has been holding for a long time and can no longer carry quietly. She had told him she didn't know what that meant, and he had looked at her with those dark amber eyes, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and said, "I think you do." Then the council had summoned him for his coronation preparations, and he had gone, and the weeks that followed had hardened into months, and the months into seasons, and the letters between them had become formal, and then sparse, and then nothing. She had told herself it was better. A king needed a queen, and a queen needed bloodlines, and Sorcha had exactly none of what that required. She had believed, above all, that he had understood that too. The garden wall was cold through her skirt. She should go inside. She had work. She always had work. The ward steward had seen to that, piling her days with inventory and correspondence, and the small grinding tasks that kept an unmated Omega useful and invisible. She had become very good at useful and invisible. She did not go inside. She sat with the bare rose canes and the pale winter sky until she heard boots on the frost-cracked path, and she did not have to look up to know whose they were. "I thought I would find you here," Merrick said. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply stopped remembering accurately. He wore no crown. He rarely did within the keep, which had always been one of the things the council disliked about him. His hair was darker at the temples than it had been, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there at midsummer 4 years ago. He was Caucasian and broad-shouldered, and looked, as he had always looked, like a man who found the business of being a king considerably less interesting than the business of being himself. He sat down on the wall beside her without asking. You heard, she said. It was not a question. I heard you in the corridor, he said. Your breathing changes when you're trying not to react. That is an unsettling thing to know about a person. I have known it about you since you were 16, and the old council tried to reassign your room to a visiting dignitary. He paused. You were furious. You breathed like a bellows. I was furious, she agreed. It was my room. The familiar ease of it, talking to him, arrived without warning, the way warmth arrives when you step from shadow into sun. She hated it slightly. She had worked hard to be over the particular agony of Merrick, and here he was dismantling 4 years of careful architecture simply by sitting beside her on a cold wall. The council is very committed to their candidate list, she said. The council is committed to managing me, he said. It is not the same thing. Merrick. Sorcha. She looked at him then, because there was no avoiding it when he said her name like that, like it was the specific word he had been waiting to say all morning. His amber eyes held steady on her face, and she felt the mate bond stir in her chest, low and certain, the way it had stirred every time she had allowed herself to be this close to him. She had always tried to classify it as imagination. Standing this close to him, she could no longer manage it. You said no, she said. I did. That is not a sustainable position. The council has the old law on their side. The succession requires... I know what the succession requires. He was not impatient with her. He was never impatient with her, which had always been its own kind of difficulty. I have read the old law more carefully than the council believes I have. There are provisions they are not citing. She stared at him. What provisions? The law requires a mate who can sustain the bloodline. It does not specify that the bloodline must belong to a council-approved family. He held her gaze. It requires a fated mate, Sorcha, the recognized bond. That clause predates the council's authority by 400 years. Her mouth went dry. You are reaching. I am citing law. Merrick, I have no standing bloodline. I am an Omega ward with a dead surname and no assets, and the council will eat you alive if you try to use a 400-year-old. They have been trying to eat me alive since I was crowned, he said, calm and direct. They have not managed it yet. She stood. She needed to put distance between herself and the quiet certainty of him, because it was doing things to her resolve that she could not afford. She took 3 steps toward the bare rose canes and stopped. You cannot step down, she said. Not over this. I have no intention of stepping down. The title said, the counselor said, Aldrich says many things, Merrick said. This morning he told my assembled council that I require their guidance in selecting a mate because, and I believe I am quoting accurately, I have demonstrated poor judgment in matters of personal attachment. He paused. He was looking at the ward records when he said it. Your ward records. She turned. They know. They have known for some time, I think. They have simply not said it aloud until now, because saying it aloud required them to also say that I have refused every candidate they have presented for 4 years. His voice was quiet. I have not been subtle, Sorcha. I thought you understood that. She had not understood it. Or rather, she had understood it, and had spent 4 years reclassifying it as a king's general reluctance to be managed, because the alternative was believing something that could not be safe to believe. They will fight it, she said. If you cite the fated mate clause, they will contest the bond. They will require evidence. They will call witnesses and pull records, and they will find every gap in my family history and use it. Yes, he said. They will. And you still said no this morning. I said no this morning. She pressed her palm flat against the trunk of the bare climbing rose. The bark was rough and cold and real. She needed something real. I heard you, she said, through the door. Before you said no, there was a silence. You thought about it. I thought about how to say it so that Aldrich could not immediately call a procedural challenge, Merrick said. I was not thinking about whether. You were never thinking about whether. No. The word was as quiet and complete as the no he had given the council, and it worked on her the same way. Landed, expanded, refused to be managed. She had spent 4 years being practical. She had spent 4 years being useful and invisible, and reminding herself, on the bad mornings, that an Omega ward did not get to keep a king, and that the mate bond she felt in her chest was either one-sided or irrelevant, and that the kindest thing she could do for both of them was to take up as little space as possible. She had been very good at taking up very little space. "Sorcha," he said, and he had moved. He was standing 2 feet from her now, close enough that she could smell cedarwood and cold iron and the specific warmth that was only him. "I need you to tell me something." She did not look at him. She looked at the bare rose canes. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "The bond. I am not asking whether you think it's convenient, or whether you've decided it's practical, or whether you've spent 4 years convincing yourself it isn't real. I'm asking whether you feel it." Her throat was very tight. "That is an unfair question," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." She felt the bond in her chest like a coal kept carefully banked, the kind that looks like ash but holds heat for days. She had carried it for 4 years. She had stopped expecting him to ask about it. "I feel it," she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. He exhaled, a slow, careful breath, the kind that releases something held very long. "Then we have work to do," he said. "The council will convene a formal hearing within the week. Aldrich will move quickly now that he's named the issue aloud. I need you to let me show them." She turned and looked at him. His face was open and certain, and very tired in the way of a man who has been patient for a long time and is done pretending the patience is comfortable. "Show them what?" she said. "That I have not made a mistake, that you are exactly what I chose." He paused. "And that the bond between us is real, which they will be able to detect if they bring a truth reader to the hearing, and which I believe Aldrich will regret requesting." Despite everything, something moved in her chest that was almost like laughter. "You are very confident," she said. "I have been watching you be underestimated for 4 years," he said. "I have some data to work with." The week that followed was the worst and most clarifying of Sorcha's life. She had not known what it felt like to be looked at directly, not managed, not shuffled, not categorized as useful and invisible, until Merrick installed her in the rooms adjacent to the king's working chambers, and the council began to treat her presence as the crisis it apparently was. She found she did not mind the scrutiny. She had been invisible for a long time. Scrutiny at least had the advantage of honesty. Aldrich sent representatives twice to speak with her privately. The first time, a young man with careful eyes and a practiced smile told her that the king's attachment was a phase, and that she would be doing the kingdom a service by withdrawing from the situation before it became embarrassing. She thanked him for his time. The second time, an older woman with a sheaf of documents told her that her ward records contained several irregularities that might, if examined publicly, reflect poorly on her. Sorcha asked to see the documents. The woman blinked. Sorcha pointed to 3 clerical errors that the woman had not noticed herself, which were far more likely to reflect poorly on the council's record-keeping than on Sorcha's history, and the woman left without another word. Marek heard about both visits before evening and said nothing beyond, "Good." The single syllable managed to carry considerable satisfaction. She slept badly all week, not from fear, from the particular agony of knowing something true that she had spent 4 years refusing to know, and having it live in her chest like a warm coal that she no longer had any reason to bank. The bond hummed at night in the quiet, when there was nothing else to manage. She lay awake, and felt it, and did not try to reclassify it. She missed him when he was 3 rooms away. That was the extent of her dignity now, and she found she was not as troubled by it as she would have expected. On the 4th morning, she found him in the working chamber before dawn, standing at the wide window with a cup of cold tea and a face that suggested he had also slept badly. "The truth reader," she said. "What exactly does the test require?" He turned. He was in plain clothes again, dark wool, no crown, and the firelight from the hearth threw amber over his face and turned his eyes the color of old honey. "The truth reader places her hands over both our wrists," he said. "She reads the bond as it presents in the blood. If the mate bond is genuine, it will be visible to her. It reads differently from infatuation or political alliance. The council cannot dispute the reading. It is considered incontrovertible under the old law." "And if it reads as genuine," Sorcha said carefully, "what does that mean for Aldrich's candidate list?" "It becomes void," Merrick said. "Fated mate precedence supersedes council recommendation. There is no procedural path around it." "And the bloodline requirement?" "A fated mate's offspring inherit the bond's legitimacy, regardless of family standing." "That's the clause they haven't cited." His voice was steady. "Aldrich knows it. He's been hoping I don't." She looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. Not about the law, about them. He understood the question. "Since I was 18, and you argued with the old council's secretary for 40 minutes about the ward's grain allocation," he said. "You had a ledger. You had annotated the margin in red. You were 16. You cited 3 precedents from memory, and then asked him whether he'd like to take notes." A pause. I remember thinking that whoever was fated to stand beside her was going to have to be very awake, all the time, to keep up. Something spread through Sorcha's chest that was too large to name quickly. "That is a very specific memory," she said. "I have an extensive collection," he said. He crossed the room to where she stood and stopped close enough that she could see the dark line of exhaustion beneath his eyes and the very still way he held himself, as though he had been careful for so long that the care had become structural. "I am going to win this hearing," he said. "I want you to know that. Not because I require you to be brave, or because I need you to perform confidence for the council's benefit, but because you have spent 4 years being practical on my behalf, without my ever asking you to, and I think you have earned the right to know that I have not been sitting in my king's chambers making peace with losing you. I have been building a case." She had not cried in front of another person since her parents died. She was not going to cry now, in a cold working chamber before dawn, in front of a king who was looking at her like she was the specific answer to a very long question. She was not. "Merrick," she said. "Sorcha. If the council disputes the reading, then we dispute their dispute, together." He said it the way he said everything, simply, as though the conclusion were already real and they were only discussing the steps to reach it. She had been practical for 4 years. She had taken up very little space. She had told herself, on the worst mornings, that the mate bond she carried was a private thing and a quiet grief, and that the most dignified path was to hold it carefully and not let it inconvenience anyone. Standing this close to him, the bond was not a coal anymore. It was a fire. It had always been a fire. She had simply been very determined about the ash. "All right," she said. He waited. "All right," she said again, and this time, she let herself mean it the full distance. "Build your case. I'll annotate the margins." Something broke open in his face. Not grief, not relief, but the specific easing of a man who has held a very long breath and finally let it go. He reached out and took both her hands, and the bond lit through her like the first full note of a song she had known the melody of for years, but never heard at full volume, and she held on. The hearing convened 6 days later in the great chamber. Aldrich had arranged it with the thoroughness of a man who expected to win. The 12-seat council table was filled. The truth reader, a quiet woman named Braid, older than anyone else in the room and carrying the particular authority of someone who does not need to perform it, sat at the far end with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance. Sorcha wore gray wool and her family's one piece of heraldic embroidery, a narrow border of silver thread at the cuffs of her sleeves, the only material record she had of who she came from. She had never worn it publicly before. She wore it now because Merrick had asked her to bring everything she was into the room, and this was part of what she was. Aldrich opened proceedings by stating the council's position in the precise language of a man who had spent a week polishing it. He cited bloodline requirements, social standing requirements, the council's traditional authority in matters of royal succession, and then, with the careful precision of a man placing a blade, he cited Sorcha by name. He described her status as an Omega ward. He noted the absence of documented bloodline. He noted her age, her rank, and then, and here his voice took on the specific satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to say something for a very long time. He noted that the king's attachment, however sincere, could not in good conscience be permitted to direct policy. He did not call her unfit. He had been careful not to repeat the word since the corridor. He didn't need to. The room understood him. Sorcha kept her breathing even. Merrick sat beside her, still and unhurried, and she felt the warmth of him against her left arm and did not allow herself to lean toward it. Merrick responded. He was precise, and he was thorough, and when he cited the fated mate clause from the old law, Aldrich's expression did not change, which told Sorcha that he had known it was coming and had prepared. He raised a counter-argument about the clause's historical application, suggesting that it had not been applied in 300 years and could not be considered active precedent. Marek said, "I have prepared the historical record, all 11 instances of application in the archive. Lady Sorcha helped me locate and annotate them." He placed the document on the table. "She is very thorough." The nearest counselor reached for it involuntarily. Bread, the truth reader, said nothing. She waited. Aldrich pivoted. He questioned the bond itself. He suggested, carefully, with a politician's precision, that what the king experienced as a fated mate bond might be an attachment of affection rather than blood recognition, and that without verification, the council could not be expected to set aside its legitimate authority. Merrick said, "That is why the truth reader is present." And so Brede stood. She came to stand before them both, and she held out her hands, and Sorcha placed her wrist across one palm, and Merrick placed his across the other, and the truth reader closed her eyes. The chamber went very still. Sorcha felt the bond in her chest, and in her wrists, and in the specific warmth of Brede's dry, quiet hands. She felt it the way she had always felt it, certain and low, and running through her like water through old stone, shaped by the channel it had carved over years. She felt Merrick's pulse through Braid's palm, and she did not look at him, and she breathed. Braid opened her eyes. She addressed the council directly, without preamble. "The bond is genuine," she said. "It is recognized. It is old. This is not a new attachment. This bond has been present and unmated for a considerable time." She paused. "Years." Aldrich said, "Brede." "The reading is the reading," Brede said, with the particular calm of someone who has no political obligations and does not intend to acquire any. "Under the old law, this bond supersedes council recommendation in matters of succession. I will enter my finding in the formal record." She withdrew her hands, nodded once to Sorcha and once to Merrick, and returned to her seat. The chamber held its silence for a moment that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Aldrich looked at Sorcha for the first time since the hearing began. His gaze was the gaze of a man assessing a revised landscape, recalculating rather than conceding. "The ward's bloodline remains undocumented," he said. Merrick said, "It is documented. We have the archive record." He placed a second document beside the first. Her mother was of the old border families. The line was not prominent, but it is traceable, and it is clean. Sorcha found the primary document herself. He paused. "Aldrich, she has been managing your council's clerical errors for 4 years, without credit. I think we can begin crediting her now." The color that rose in Aldrich's face was not quite embarrassment, and not quite anger. It was something between them, which Sorcha thought was probably accurate. The vote was not unanimous. 4 councillors abstained. 3, including Aldrich, voted in formal opposition, but the majority held, and the old law held, and by the time the chamber emptied into the gray afternoon, the candidate list had been formally withdrawn. Marek did not celebrate. He took her elbow gently and walked her out into the corridor, and then into the small anteroom off the main passage, where the light came through a south-facing window and fell warm even in January, and he closed the door. She had been holding herself very straight for the duration of the hearing. She let herself unbend slightly now, just enough to press her back against the cool stone wall and close her eyes for a moment. "You found the archive record yourself," he said. "You said to bring everything I was into the room," she said. "I thought documentation would be useful." "When did you find it?" "The third night," she said. "I couldn't sleep. I went to the archive. I was looking for the fated mate clause applications. I wanted to read them myself, and I found the Border family records alongside them, and I thought—" She stopped. "I didn't know my mother had that history. She never told me, or she didn't get the chance to. Either way." She opened her eyes. "It doesn't change who I am, but it mattered to show them." "It mattered because it was true," Marek said, "not because it was useful." She looked at him. He was standing in the fall of winter sunlight, and the light picked out the amber in his eyes and made him look like something from an illuminated manuscript, large and serious, and quietly certain. The most dangerous lies, she thought, were the ones you told yourself. She had been telling herself for 4 years that this was a quiet grief to carry, and not a real thing. The real thing was standing in front of her, looking at her the way he always looked at her, like she was the specific answer and had always been. She was not going to tell herself the lie again. "You said you've been building a case for 4 years, she said. "I have." "That is a very long time to be practical about something," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have not enjoyed it." "I haven't either," she said. "I want to register that officially." "Officially registered," he said, and the corner of his mouth shifted, and it was the closest she had seen him come to relieved in a week, and she crossed the small distance between them and put her hand flat against his sternum, the way she had pressed it against the cold bark of the rose in the garden, except this was warm. He was warm. He brought his hand up and covered hers, and the bond between them was not a banked coal anymore, and not even a fire. It was simply the state of things, as steady and real as the stone beneath her feet. "The council will make this difficult," she said, against the front of his shirt. "The council will eventually adjust," he said. "Aldrich will retire in a few years, and the younger members are considerably less committed to managing me. And until then? Until then, you annotate the margins, and I cite the law, and we continue to be more prepared than they expect." He pressed his cheek to the top of her head. "You are very good at preparation." "I have been told I am useful," she said. "You are not useful to me," he said, with a directness that cut clean through the usual softening. "You are necessary. There is a difference, and the council can learn it." She stood in the warm circle of him and felt the bond settle into something that was not ache anymore, something that was simply present and intended to stay. She had been carrying it as grief for so long that she had not noticed, until this moment, that the same thing carried differently had another name entirely. Spring would come slowly to the mountain keep. It always did. The frost held through March, and the roses in the ward's garden took until April to show any evidence of their intentions. But they did come. They always came. And when the first green appeared on the climbing canes along the garden wall, the same wall where Sorcha had sat in January and heard a king refuse the council's list, and recognized the sound of her own name in his voice, she was not sitting there alone. She was there with her annotated Border family documents spread across the low wall, arguing pleasantly with Marek about the historical application of the fated mate clause to a mid-succession complication that Aldrich had raised in council that morning, and the sun was properly warm for the first time, and the bond in her chest was not a coal or a fire or a grief. It was the state of things. It was morning and cedar warmth and amber eyes that had been watching her argue with authority since she was 16 years old, and it was exactly, precisely, completely what she was.